Men who understand female nature are labeled toxic because the moment a man understands female nature, he stops being useful to the illusion. How? I am Ming So, a monk from the quiet mountains. I do not offer comfort, I offer clarity. If you've ever felt punished for improving yourself, what I'm about to explain will make your entire past make sense. You didn't become cruel. You didn't become manipulative. You became accurate, and accuracy destabilizes narratives. Behavioral examples. You stop apologizing for emotions you didn't cause. You set boundaries without explaining them. You disengage instead of arguing. You notice words and actions no longer match, and suddenly, you're different. Not better, not worse. Just harder to control. Let's strip away the poetry. Attraction is not a moral process. It's a biological imperative. Every woman, yes, every woman, operates under evolutionary pressures she did not choose, just like every man. Selection didn't care about fairness. It cared about outcomes. Confidence signals safety. Emotional regulation signals strength. Detachment signals abundance. And when you understand this, when you see attraction as a hardwired system driven by dopamine, novelty, and perceived value, you stop romanticizing behavior that was never romantic to begin with. That awareness threatens something deeper than feelings. It threatens the social story. Here's the part no one explains to you. No one sits you down and says, the moment you understand the system will respond. Because what you're experiencing isn't personal. It's neurological. It's psychological. It's automatic. When you start seeing patterns, real patterns, not isolated incidents, you activate a threat response in other people's minds. Not because you're attacking them, but because you're naming something that was meant to stay unspoken. The human brain is wired for narrative safety. Stories keep groups stable. Stories reduce anxiety. When someone disrupts the story, the brain doesn't debate. It defends. The amygdala lights up. Cortisol rises. Rational thought drops. And instead of curiosity, you get labeling. Toxic, cold, emotionally unavailable, dangerous. These words aren't diagnoses. They're containment tools. Because once you're labeled, your observations can be dismissed without being addressed. Let's talk about the emotional mechanism. Attraction thrives on uncertainty and emotional contrast. Dopamine spikes when outcomes are unpredictable. Predictability flattens desire, not because anyone wants it to, but because the brain is programmed that way. So when a man learns emotional regulation, true regulation, not repression, he becomes harder to stimulate and harder to manipulate. He no longer overreacts. He no longer floods the interaction with reassurance. He no longer explains himself to earn peace. And that changes the chemistry of the dynamic. Silence removes leverage. Calm removes urgency. Boundaries remove access. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it's clarity. But clarity threatens systems built on emotional reflex. So the brain reaches for a shortcut. This feels uncomfortable, therefore it must be wrong. That's how the label is born. Not from evidence, from emotional friction. This is why men who stay reactive are considered safe. They're predictable, they're readable, they can be guided through emotion. But the man who watches, waits, and chooses his responses, he destabilizes the script. And destabilized scripts demand correction. You'll notice it in small moments first, brother. You're told you're overthinking. But the pattern keeps repeating. You're praised for confidence until it stops serving someone else's comfort. You set a boundary, and it's reframed as control. You withdraw attention, and suddenly you're accused of punishment. Case study number 1. A man stops reacting emotionally during conflict. The fights escalate, not because he's cruel, but because emotional chaos no longer works. Case study number 2. Another man notices validation has diminishing returns. He pulls back. Attraction spikes, followed by resentment. These aren't coincidences. They're mechanisms. There's an unspoken agreement holding modern relationships together. You're allowed to feel. You're allowed to express. You're allowed to struggle. But you are not allowed to explain the system. Because explanation removes innocence from behavior, and innocence is socially useful. Modern culture doesn't collapse because people act on instinct. It collapses when people admit they're acting on instinct. So the rule becomes simple. You may participate in the game. You may not describe the game, especially if you're a man. Male awareness threatens too many structures at once. It threatens romantic narratives that rely on moral symmetry. It threatens institutions that benefit from emotional compliance. It threatens social movements built on simplified villains and heroes. And most dangerously, it threatens the idea that attraction is fair. So instead of debate, culture chooses framing. A man who notices emotional leverage is accused of wanting power. A man who sets boundaries is accused of control. A man who detaches is accused of punishment. Notice the pattern. The behavior doesn't change, only the outcome does. Confidence is praised until it stops benefiting others. Emotional intelligence is celebrated until it stops producing compliance. Then it's reclassified. This is narrative enforcement, not a conspiracy in a smoky room, but a distributed psychological reflex. Everyone participates without realizing it. Friends discourage you from overanalyzing. Partners accuse you of losing warmth. Media frames male self-command as emotional absence. All of it nudging you back into the role that keeps the system smooth. Because a man who sees clearly is harder to motivate with shame, harder to scare with abandonment, harder to extract validation from. He doesn't react fast enough. He doesn't explain himself enough. He doesn't perform remorse on demand. And that scares a culture addicted to emotional transparency. So awareness is reframed as danger, not because it hurts people, but because it removes predictability. Here's where it breaks. Relationships fracture once unconscious dynamics are exposed, not because you changed, but because the game stopped working. Friends distance themselves when you refuse to self-censor. Conversations become shallow. Truth becomes too intense. And internally, you face a choice. Suppress what you see, or accept the isolation that comes with clarity. This is the emotional destruction point. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet exile. Here it is. Understanding female nature doesn't make you cruel. It makes you responsible. Power exists whether you name it or not. Ignorance was never innocence. It was convenience. Those who benefit from your blindness will call your sight dangerous every time, because clarity removes leverage, and leverage feels like love to those who rely on it. Truth isn't rewarded publicly. It's rewarded privately, with peace. So where does that leave you? Angry? No. Resentful? That's a trap. The awakening isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming quieter. Because once you understand human nature, you realize something sobering. Most conflict is fueled by reaction. Most manipulation survives on explanation. Most emotional chaos requires participation. So the solution isn't domination, it's self-command. You stop narrating your inner world to people who haven't earned access. You stop correcting misunderstandings that cost you nothing. You stop seeking agreement where clarity already exists. This is where Stoicism enters, not as philosophy, but as survival strategy. You feel everything, but you respond selectively. You let others project without absorbing it. You let labels pass without defending against them. Because a man who knows himself doesn't need consensus. He understands that respect is often quiet and peace is rarely public. You begin moving differently, less urgency, less emotional bargaining, more observation. You speak when it matters. You leave when it doesn't. Not to punish, but because your time and attention are no longer unlimited resources. This is the masculine resolution no one sells, because it can't be marketed. No slogans, no applause, no validation, just internal alignment. You don't need to be understood by a world that benefits from misunderstanding you. You don't need to convince anyone you're not toxic, because the strongest men don't waste energy disproving labels. They outgrow the environments that require them. You cross an invisible line. If you've ever felt punished for improving yourself, what I'm about to explain will make your entire past make sense. You didn't become cruel. You didn't become manipulative. You became accurate. And accuracy destabilizes narratives. Behavioral examples. You stop apologizing for emotions you didn't cause. You set boundaries without explaining them. You disengage instead of arguing. You notice words and actions no longer match. And suddenly, you're different. Not better, not worse, just harder to control. And that's the final truth. Awareness doesn't make you lonely. It makes you selective. And in a world built on emotional noise, selectivity is power.